Did have a quick you mentioned you also wrote a book recently. I think it came out in, I believe it was August of last year. And it's titled The Social Origins of Electoral Participation in Emerging Democracies. So you've been researching, you've been looking into, voter turnout and what drives that stuff for a while now. Talk about your research.
Well, it's interesting. That project that you mentioned and the research that we did there actually mostly took place in Africa and South Asia. But it was very much informed by what we know about voter turnout and what drives people to the polls in the United States. And so it's interesting now to kind of think about how the two are related and how they're actually very different in a lot of ways.
And let's talk the related part. Obviously, being here and having the elections here for, hundreds of years, and then going over there to these emerging democracies. What are some of the things you're seeing there that may differ from here, or some of the things from here that have been brought over there and kind of helped kind of formulate or inform those decision-making processes in terms of developing their elections?
Sure. Well, this may come as a surprise to your viewers, but for a long period of time, why people actually turn out to vote has been a very curious puzzle in political science. And the reason it's curious is because it's actually costly to vote. It takes time to learn about the candidates, to obtain information that helps you make your decision. And then it literally costs time to go to a polling station, or in state of Washington, where we have mail-in ballots, to go get your ballot from the mail, fill it out, put it back in the mail. And so it's costly. On the other side of it, the probability that any one ballot is going to be decisive in an election is essentially zero. So you may care about the issues, you may care about the candidates, but at the end of the day, any one individual ballot is very unlikely to swing the outcome. And it's actually kind of costly to vote to begin with. So the puzzle has always been, well, then why do so many people vote? Why do people vote in all types of societies, whether the democracies are old or young? In the United States, the idea is that even though voting is costly and no one ballot really ever decides an election, people have this intrinsic sense that they should vote because they have a duty to uphold democratic principles, and that's kind of what's motivating them to do that. In newer democracies, how that would operate is a little bit less clear because they have less experience with democratic institutions and democratic practices. And so there we think it's not just about showing up and signaling support for a democratic regime type, but it's also a way to signal to the government that people in poor developing democracies, countries, really expect something in return from their politicians, and they really expect those politicians to deliver to them at the local level. And turning out to vote is a good signal to that.
Now, you mentioned the costliness of voting here in America, and that's not necessarily costly as in writing a check or filling out dollar signs. It's more of a motivation and, breaking the inertia to get up off the couch and go to the mailbox, or get in the car and go to the ballot box, or even, like you said in the beginning, learn about the candidates.
That's correct. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. It's the individual cost to the voter for actually taking the time to cast a ballot. And there, the costs very much vary in the United States, which is very interesting. Unlike state of Washington, a lot of states, people do have to take time off of work or figure out a way to vote in person, and that can take a lot more time. But like you said, I have found that when I voted in person, for example, in California and Massachusetts, it didn't actually take that much longer than it takes me to get my ballot in state of Washington, kind of go through it, make sure I understand the issues, and then put it back in an envelope and stick it in the mail. That being said, we have very, very, very high turnout in state of Washington, and I think a lot of that is due in part to having mail-in ballots.
What's the old additive? It's like time is money. So, when you get into this thing where you start having to leave work for the whole day, that really eats into that time is money kind of aspect of it all, right? You're using time, you're taking it off work, losing money. But here in Washington, you said we've had high turnout because of the mail-in ballot system. Has the mail-in increased the turnout in the state of Washington compared to where it was before the mail-in came around?
It's a tricky thing to study whether or not that there's a causal relationship there. But I think if you look at states in the country that have primarily or almost exclusively mail-in ballot voting, like Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, it does tend to be very, very high and consistently so. And not just high for presidential elections, but also for off-year elections or congressional elections. The other thing I would say is with mail-in ballots is that you're right that time is money, but information is also time. And so I have a PhD in political science. And so most people would think I can look at a ballot and already know all the issues and how I think about things, and it's perfectly clear to me. Well, the fact is it's not. I have to do a lot of research on my own. And so that that sort of gaining information is also takes time if people are considering the issues. And so that's why I kind of laugh to my students when I teach this. Like, of all the people that it should take the least amount of time, it should be a professor of political science. And it still does take me some time and effort to gain that information.
Now, I kind of want to talk a little bit into the how did I? Oh, yeah. You said when you were talking about elections in some of these developing countries that they require more of their local elected officials. It seems to be there's more stakes in these developing, elections in developing countries that we've kind of lost here at home. We're not. It doesn't seem like we're doing a lot of expecting in terms of some of our local elected officials. We have a lot of situations where people are voting at 20% turnout, 26% turnout. So it seems like a majority of folks aren't really caring about the issues or even wanting to hold the local electors accountable. Maybe that might be wrong in my perspective. I'm hoping you can tell me wrong. But
No,
that kind of seems like.
no, I think you're headed in the right direction. One of the things that we're noticing in the United States is that all elections are becoming national or nationalized. Even local elections for your local city council person or for your local congressperson is really now driven by things that you're thinking about at the national level. And it used to be the case that, you might vote for a Republican or a Democrat for president, but when it came to the Senate or Congress or your local city councilor, you might split your vote. And that was very, very common until recently, because you think about, okay, has this congressperson brought home the bacon, as they say? Have they opened projects? Have they done well in their district? And that, I think, is being lost a lot in the United States. And what's driving people are far less to be local issues and more national issues. But those local issues in newer democracies are absolutely critical. In new democracies, because these countries are poor, they very often don't have direct access to national politics. And the national leadership is not necessarily worried about local issues. And so one of the things that we write about in the book is how important it is for citizens in poor countries really to turn out to signal for their local politicians to deliver to their areas as best they can.
And, you mentioned that these local elections are becoming more so nationally looked at in a perspective that is like on the national scale. But when you look at some of these local elections, you got taxes, you got, tax breaks for companies, you have, allocations of money, things like that. A lot of that seems to be happening in the background, but it affects the citizens of those areas in the day to day. It could affect them as soon as next week, as opposed to, say, Congress, or where it takes them quite a while to get a bill done. So it seems like even in the local elections where things are affecting us in the day to day and could affect us as soon as next week, are often taking a back seat to these local issues that may take weeks or months or even years to affect us.
David, that's a great point. And that's why one of the things I joke about with my students is that everything you just described may not be apparent. But regardless of whether people turn out to vote, folks in Olympia, folks in Washington, D.C., they're going to make policy. They're going to pass programs. City of Seattle, Tri-City, Spokane, they're going to pass legislation. They're going to implement policies. They're going to tax. They're going to spend. So the way in which they do that is likely to reflect the interest of those who actually turn out. And if people are not informed about local issues, or whatever that locality is, I think you're right that then they're going to feel disengaged from the process. But what I tell my students is, don't be surprised then if your generation is not turning out. Don't be surprised if the policies in Seattle, Olympia, DC reflect the folks that do turn out, because you have to signal that you're paying attention and that this matters to you. And further than that, beyond just turning out, if a party is not doing well or a candidate hasn't done well, you have to turn out to vote for some alternative, and that's important as well.
One of the things I was chatting with an election official here in our neck of the woods, he says something along the lines, if you don't participate in it, you're giving your voice to someone else to do it. Because, someone else is going to vote, and it may be 30% voter turnout, but those 30% are basically getting the voice of the 70% as well, choosing not to vote. Is that kind of a similar sentiment that you kind of have in terms of the people who don't vote?
Absolutely. And we know a lot. It depends on context and state, but we actually know a lot about those 30% who always turn out. In the United States, they're primarily older, they're primarily white, and they're primarily people that have already voted or voted kind of consistently throughout their lifetime. So this is another, argument I make for people who feel like they're disengaged from the political process, or like government isn't doing a lot for them. I can understand that feeling, but at the end of the day, if you don't turn out and show up, then government doesn't have a reason to necessarily care about you and your issues. And it absolutely will take care of those that are making the effort to show up, for sure.
And speaking of, making the effort to show up, I was talking to this election official, and he said something along the lines of the reason we have, elections kind of sparsed out, like one in February, one in April, one, as we move our way into, the general. He says the reason we have them spaced out like this is in February to get the people who actually care, the people who really want to go out and vote. Because it would be easier to do it all at once, but then you'd get, a bunch of people maybe even undervoting or whatnot. So they really want to get the people that, I don't want to care, really, give a crap, if you will, to hit the polling places and the ballot boxes in February. Is that something you've also noticed here in the state or across your, educational background that some states put, separate the elections to get more people in the door that truly care?
Yeah, and I think both of the parties are guilty of trying to massage that in ways that might help them. If you are hardcore Democrat or you're hardcore Republican, you really only want your base to turn out. So if you think you can have an election in kind of an off year cycle or off month cycle, but you'll still be able to reach those voters, you might do better than if it has much larger turnout and more reflective of the electorate. I actually think it's funny that you asked this. I think one of the positive things about state of Washington is when you do register, as long as you stay at your address, they'll send you a ballot for all of the primaries and all of the elections. You don't have to request them individually. And the funny thing is even though I'm a political science professor, I'll often receive a ballot in the mail before I even really know what it is we're voting on. I had forgotten that we were having a primary so early in Washington state this year and that it had moved up and it's no longer a caucus. And so when I received my primary ballot, I was kind of surprised because I was thinking about all these other states that were having their primaries earlier. And so I think that's a good innovation to make sure that even in those off year, off month cycles, the more people turn out. But it gets back to that costly information thing. It requires a lot on the part of citizens to be mindful that they may have an opportunity to vote, not every 4 years or even every 2 years or even every 1 year, but kind of consistently throughout the year.
And, one of the things you talked about is, alluding to it, if you will, is driving the interest in those topics, driving the interest to get out there. You can drive interest, but you can't necessarily drive action. So how can you change interest? Granted, not everybody's going to do their research. Some people are just going to, let's say, all right, well, I just know the names, I just know the D's or the R's, and I'm just going to check those boxes off. But how do you drive interest to learn more about it? And then how do you translate that interest into action? I feel like that's kind of the biggest hurdle for a lot of voters is, yeah, I'm interested, but I don't know anything about it. And since I don't know anything, I don't want to vote. So how do you kind of bring that whole thing into like a flow chart and streamline the situation?
Well, what I tell my students, and I say this in all the countries that I travel to, at the end of the day, it is incumbent upon citizens to educate themselves about the issues and to participate. Parties can try to drive turnout. Nonpartisan organizations can try to drive voter registration and turnout. Politicians are obviously going to make appeal. Social media buys, ad buys, and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it's up to citizens. And nobody is going to force, in a true democracy, nobody's going to force a person to go cast a ballot. And so it's incumbent on citizens to take their role in this process seriously, which is to educate themselves. You don't need a college degree to be an informed voter. You don't even necessarily need a high school degree to be an informed voter, although you have to be 18. But it is incumbent upon citizens to do the hard work of informing themselves, becoming educated, and then always keeping a watchful eye. It doesn't mean they have to worry about politics every single day, all the time, and worry about things like that. But it does mean that for democracy to work, citizens do have to do their part, and it's incumbent upon them to educate themselves and then actually turn out.
And it seems like in a state like Washington, a lot of the hard work and a lot of the upfront heavy lifting is done for you because you get you get the pamphlets every election cycle. Folks can go in and read through it. In your experience, talking with students, obviously, some of whom are voting, they're taking a poli-sci class, so they may have some interest in politics. What have you heard feedback from them in terms of, hey, these are super helpful, or no, I don't really use them. Where do you see the use, if you will, on the spectrum in terms of the voter pamphlets?
I think I started teaching at UW a little over 10 years ago, and I've continually taught the same classes. And I think, today's college students are the most engaged that I've ever seen in my lifetime. I think they are far more educated on the issues than previous cohorts, certainly than I was, and my cohorts, even those studying political science in previous decades. So I think they are activated. I think they're energized. I think they're informed. I think they understand the importance of mobilization, particularly mobilization out on the street with respect to protests and other types of actions. I think sometimes it comes at the expense of overlooking the importance of voting, but that's what I try to reinforce. And I think a lot of our young people really are in the political fold now. As to whether or not they look at the voter pamphlet or whether they just vote the party that they like or the candidates that they know, I can't say. I haven't thought about that issue, but I do agree with you that Washington State, I think, probably has made it as easy as possible for people to vote, not just giving you a nonpartisan pamphlet and sending you the ballot, but also when you send the ballot back, postage is paid for. You can go to a very convenient drop box, but if you don't live near a drop box, the postage is paid for. So I think that's another reason why I really press the citizen part in Washington, is that Washington State, unlike a lot of states, has really done its part to try to make it as easy as possible.
And you have like 18 days to vote too. So that really extends the time where folks can really do their research. They know the ballot's in the mail. They know they've got it or what have you. And at that point, that kind of is like the start line. Hey, you should maybe do some research or what have you. Here's one thing that I thought was very interesting. The election official I talked to discussed something along the lines of celebrating the ones that did vote instead of like chastising the ones that don't vote. And he's under the kind of the aspect of, instead of wagging your finger at the folks that, didn't vote and say, oh, you need to be voting, you should be voting, just say, hey, good job to all the people that did vote, because those people are, as you mentioned very early on, fulfilling their rights, their privileges as American citizens.
Yeah, in our research project, when we were in developing countries in Africa, for example, after a voter votes, they have a marker, they have a thumbprint put on their finger so that they're not able to vote a second time, so that when they leave the polling station, pretty much people can tell if they voted because there's marker on their finger. And we have a version of that, not to prevent double voting, but we have a version of that, or we did in the United States, which were those old I voted stickers. And I bring this point up exactly with my students. And I said, maybe you don't have an I voted sticker if you vote by mail, but going on social media, telling your friend group that you voted, being proud, announcing that is something that happens globally. And I agree with you that it's maybe important to focus on the pride that people should feel in the democratic process itself, regardless of how they feel about a specific policy or candidate, that they are expressing pride in the system itself. And that we all as a collective, whether that collective is folks in the Tri-Cities, state of Washington, the United States, are participating in this thing together. And even though we have deep disagreements about what we want the outcome to be, we all agree that it's important to participate. And so I like that I voted sticker. I like it when people announce on social media, and I think that's important.
Now, I want to change topic real quick because something just clicked in my brain. You mentioned before relating to the primaries that you forgot that there was a primary even happening. And you mentioned the word caucus. Was there, how long did we go, how long since it's been since we swapped over in the state of Washington from caucus to a primary?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know that I caucused in 2016.
Okay.
And then I think both of the parties in 2020, I think it was a hybrid, maybe. I can't remember off the top of my head, so I apologize on that. I think that on the Democratic side, I think on both sides now it's a primary only. I don't think there's a hybrid model. I think a lot of states have moved that way as well. Those that either were pure caucus states or those that were hybrid, just because I think it's administratively easier. Also, I think because more people turn out. When I caucused in 2016 in Washington, I was there for a few hours, and that's just how long it takes. We know that from the Iowa caucuses, and so we think of the Iowa caucuses as being an example of the real hardcore partisans on both sides turning out, but not necessarily reflective of the state more broadly. And I think that's why a lot of states have moved in the primary direction, because it's just easier. It takes less time.
Okay. Here, I just want to make sure I'm crossing all my T's, dotting all my I's here. Sure. One of the things we kind of touched on, and the election official used a different phrase. He said personal responsibility, and you alluded to that, where the citizens have to take it upon themselves to go vote. Now this might be a weird kind of question, and where's the incentive, right? Like, folks are going to get up in the morning, they're going to get ready to vote, they're going to either do their hours of research or not, or fill out the ballot fully or undervote, whatever it may be. But a lot of folks who may not vote might be asking, where's the incentive? What's the incentive for me to put my voice out there when, my voice doesn't count? My single vote doesn't count. What do you say to the folks who are looking for the incentive to get out and vote?
Well, I think it's a little bit like paying your taxes. You know, people could probably, we have an enormously complicated tax structure in the United States. A lot of people get away with not paying or not paying the right amount or kind of getting around it. But at the end of the day, the system would fall apart if we all cheated on our taxes. And at the end of the day, the government doesn't want to have to spend a bunch of resources to find who's cheating and by how much. So one of the things that we think drives people paying their taxes is not that they receive a direct benefit, but when they drive on their roads, when they check in at the airport, when they fly on a plane, when they think about their child's education, when they look at the government's COVID policy or healthcare or all the rest of it, they have some understanding that they have to contribute and that they are doing so because everybody else is contributing. And so it's both sort of pride in the system, but also like you would feel guilty if you weren't one who was contributing and you were free riding on other people paying taxes, but not you paying your taxes. And so we think that's a part of voting too. It's not that I receive a direct benefit, but I'm doing my part with a mind towards the fact that I know that everybody else is doing their part. And even people who I disagree with, and I know they're going to vote for other people, I still think that I have to do my part to uphold the system on the hope that they do their part as well.
So it seems like, it's not necessarily a team effort, but there's a little bit of that. Like track and field, if you will. Everybody has their own individual, event that they're doing, but they come together to make the whole team. So it's like team being the democratic system. And if everybody, like you said, plays a part, the things roll smoothly. But when you start getting, non-voters, less people voting, you're starting to lose the voice of the many, the people that are being represented. I kind of want to touch on undervoting for a second here, because I feel like that's another issue that really kind of slides under the radar. Most people talk about voting and non-voting, but undervoting, where people don't fill out the entire ballot. How much of a role has that played in the political science kind of verse? Whereas, some people decide, oh, I'm not, like, for instance, school elections or school levies. Oh, I don't have a kid in the school, so I'm not going to vote on it because I don't have a say in it, but I'll vote on these other things like, who's going to, in Congress or city council, but they choose not to vote for some of those things. How detrimental is undervoting and that mindset of, oh, it doesn't necessarily bother me, or I don't have any effect in it, or I don't have any dog in the fight, so I'm not going to do anything about it?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I don't have children, and so you would think that I would either be annoyed at having to vote in a city or local school election, or I would be annoyed at having to pay taxes that go into public education. But every day I interact with people that have gone through public education. I teach at the University of Washington. Most of our students have gone to public schools. When I go to buy something at the store, when I go to board an airplane, when I go to get medical care, the public education system in this country has supported most people's education. And so I do benefit from it. I may not benefit as directly as having my kid there. And so I think that's why, even if you don't have children, you care about the state of education. Even if you don't fly a lot, okay, you don't care about the conditions at the airport. You don't want planes dropping out of the sky, right? So that that could potentially harm you. So you have to pay taxes and care about whether or not the Secretary of Transportation and the system is working at the national level and also the local level. And so we can't escape as a society any of these issues. Moreover, I may care the most about the condition of roads in my community, and I may want to support candidates that are going to spend money to fix the roads in my community. But if the roads are bad, up and down I-5 or going east into the 90 and back, then that's going to affect the price of goods that I have to pay, because the transportation is going to be costlier and harder for people. So at the end of the day, everybody's affected at some level, and we all have the thing that we care about. But I think what's important is we all realize that we have to care about everything. We can care about things differentially, but the system doesn't work if we decide to selectively only care about this and not that, or pay taxes for this and not that. And so that's why I always encourage people, even though a lot of times we don't know as much about the down ballot races or the local races, to inform themselves and to make a decision.
Now I want to come back to the public education part of it, because one of the election official I chatted with, he said that, I don't want to, he basically said, start them young, get them really interested in voting. For instance, he has a ballot up on his wall in his office from his kid, where they basically did a vote on Farmer Brown versus a duck. And they're very arbitrary. He said even things as arbitrary as what we're going to do for lunch on Tuesday, right? They can put that into a vote and then get kids interested in voting, because that does affect them. And if you start them young, they'll keep doing that, keep participating in that sort of process. And he says eventually, once you start voting, it'll just click. Is that something that you kind of agree with, or is that something that you also have some sense of understanding of? Maybe I'm just gonna leave it at that. Is that something you share sentiment with?
Yeah, and the data suggests too in the United States that once people vote, they're far more likely to vote again than if they haven't voted before. And so it does become routine. It does become something that people become more familiar with. As a political junkie, I was really excited when I turned 18 to vote for the first time. I assume that some people may not be as excited, or may feel that they're not as informed, or that they, maybe shouldn't be participating for whatever reason. I agree with you that we should try to encourage that at a young age. Certain states are innovating, allowing when folks go to get their driver's license, even if they're below the age of 18, at that point, they could register to vote, even if they're 16 or 17, so that once they turn 18, they would automatically be sent a ballot. They wouldn't have to go back and register. As a child of the 80s and 90s, I actually remember not only did we talk a lot about voting and ballots, but every presidential election as a class, we would actually have debates for both sides of the candidates and then vote as a collective. It was a secret ballot, so we didn't necessarily know how any of our friends or peers in the class voted. But for the reflective of the actual race, maybe that's a little too polarizing in this moment in this country, but I think it's very interesting. And it basically tells children, look, someday you're going to have to make the choice that your parents and your older siblings are making right now. So yeah, why not start them young and getting them to think about that process so it becomes more familiar and not so alien or alienating.
Yeah, I mean, and like you said, I mean, you get started in discussing like the national elections that are actually going on, say the presidential, that may not fit for like, fourth graders, but you can still make a voting kind of system for a fourth grader to talk about things that are affecting them in the day to day. One of the questions I wanted to ask a psychologist, if you will, and I don't know, feel free if you can't answer this to just let me know. But is there like a tipping point in terms of things that get people motivated? Coming back to where in the beginning where we talked about how a lot of stuff can happen in the background. We put our things on the ballot and then things happen in the background. Is there a tipping point where something has to get kind of put in front of the face or really affecting someone before they get their motivation to go do something? Say they don't have the interest in the election, but necessarily the interest in the topic. How much does that topic have to affect them before they really get motivated to get out to the polls?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think what I would say is that one of the things that we know about voters is, for political junkies, we're always engaging in political news. And so we sort of think that, everybody already knows how they're going to vote. Everybody, like, everything's locked in. And it is for a lot of people. But I think for a lot of other people, the election's in November. They have to send their kids to school. They have to pay their taxes. They want to go on vacation. They might start a new job. They have a lot of other things that they have to worry about before that. And so I think one of the things that we see is, ad buys and political ads and stuff like that are really going to ramp up closer to the election to remind people. But if I were to see an ad right now for Trump or Biden on TV, I may not just think that hard about it or think that much about it. And so I think that's why we see a lot of reminders on nonpartisan organizations for people to vote closer to the election. That's why we see bigger ad buys to remind people that this is what they have to do. And I think, one of the things I tell my students too is, like, don't let politics be your entire life. Care about the issues, participate, but you have to do other things in your life and you can't let it consume you. So it's sort of balancing, how do I participate in a healthy way, but also have things that are not about politics in my life that I'm thinking about. And then once it's electoral season, think about, okay, well, what are the issues that I care about? How am I going to vote?
Now, James, it seems like you've just answered my last question. We have about 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to quickly ask this one. Oh yeah. If there's like one last thing, obviously we've talked a lot about voter turnout and how to drive to the polls and what stops people from voting, which is mainly that big cost of time and, whatever it may be, motivation, getting out there to do it. What would you say to the folks who say, I don't have time, or or, I really don't think I care enough to vote, or to for any of those folks who are deciding to undervote, not vote. What would you say to the folks that are not participating in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult question because in a free and fair democracy, we don't want to force people to do anything. I mean, not voting is maybe perhaps seen as democratic as voting because maybe you're saying I'm going to protest by disengaging from the process altogether. And we certainly don't want to force people to vote. I think it all comes about in terms of like, how do you calibrate the carrot and the stick? How do you convince them, help them make the decision to vote, make it easy for them? That's on the carrot side. Explain to them the importance of doing it and educating them on that. But the stick side being like, look, everybody else is doing it. Your other colleagues, other people in your community are doing it. They're doing their part. You kind of got to do your part too. And yeah, it takes a little bit of education and time and information and things like that. Certainly don't cast a ballot if you don't want to, but it's really important for this. If nobody voted, then what would happen? And so then getting them to think about, well, these other people are voting, so we're going to have politicians and parties and policies that reflect their interests. If you care about what's happening in your life, in your household, in your community, in your state, in your country, then you have to become informed and you have to participate.
And that kind of brings up another question. Obviously, within the news, we do talk about what's going on in the elections. But if you could kind of put a ratio on it, where obviously, as you mentioned, it's up to the individuals, the personal responsibility to get out, to learn about the issues, things like that. How much of that would you say, if you put it in a ratio, in terms of news informing people, telling people about the issues versus the personal responsibility to take it on and learn about it themselves? Where would that ratio lie?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I think it probably depends
Mhm.
um, for the individual, and it depends on what they're used to and how they grew up and how they've thought about these things, and maybe the behavior of their parents or their household or their siblings.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how to think about that.
Do you know of any studies in your research and whatnot that kind of sheds light onto the role news organizations or other types of informative institutions play in terms of keeping voters informed and voters feeling informed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do know one of the reasons and I'm going to have to go a little bit earlier than 6 minutes, if that's okay.
No, that's fine.
To,
We
yeah.
can end it on your answer here.
Okay. So I think one of the things we do know is the importance of local media. So I'm really glad that you're covering this story because local media is nonpartisan and it's informing people on the issues and what to expect without sort of leaning one direction or the other. The problem is with national media, both on the left and the right, people are in their own information ecosystem. So if you watch MSNBC, for example, if you're a Democrat or you're a Republican and you watch Fox News or Newsmax, then you're constantly being fed the same kind of partisan party line without really seeing the other side at all. And kind of that's why I support a lot of local media, because local media, I think, is in a lot of ways the only source that folks have just to be educated about, okay, when is election day, what to expect with your ballot, who's running, what are they promising, blah blah blah, without trying to tip the scales. And for those that are constantly in that information ecosystem in national media, I think they're just constantly the same message is being reinforced and they're not ever seeing the alternative to what they believe or what they think.